She simply bought an old bag at a regular garage sale, expecting nothing special. But while restoring it, she noticed a strange detail, and soon realized that something had been hidden inside, something no one was meant to discover for decades. That single discovery changed her life forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The neighborhood had not disappeared all at once. It had thinned, quieted, and hollowed over decades, like metal eaten slowly from the inside by rust. What remained of it lay on the east side of Detroit, where factories once breathed heat and smoke into the sky, and men poured out of their gates at dusk with grease on their hands and wages in their pockets. Now the gates were sealed, the windows blackened, the smokestacks cold and cracked. Wind moved freely where machinery once roared, carrying dust through empty lots and down streets that had forgotten the sound of shift whistles. Rows of houses still stood, though many were no longer lived in. Some had sagging porches and plywood nailed over the windows. Others leaned at odd angles, their foundations compromised by time and neglect. A few remained stubbornly occupied, their lawns trimmed, their steps swept, as if order itself were an act of defiance. On those streets, memory clung to the brick and wood more tightly than paint ever could. It was a place where the past had not been erased but abandoned, left to weather in plain sight. Esther Mason lived in one of the houses that refused to fall. It was small, narrow, and built of dark red brick, its mortar lines repaired more than once by her own hands. The roof had been patched so many times that no two shingles quite matched. The front door creaked when opened, not from neglect but from age, the sound familiar enough to be comforting. Behind the house sat a detached garage that had long ago stopped sheltering cars and had instead become something closer to a sanctuary. Each morning followed the same rhythm. Esther rose before the sun, not because she needed to, but because her body had learned that hour decades ago when factory shifts and domestic work ruled the clock. She moved slowly but deliberately, her joints stiff yet obedient, her balance careful. She brewed coffee strong enough to cut through sleep and drank it standing at the kitchen counter, staring out the window at the alley where weeds pushed through broken concrete. The world outside rarely surprised her anymore. After breakfast, she crossed the narrow yard to the garage, unlocking the door with a key worn smooth by years of use. Inside, the air carried the mixed scents of old leather, metal filings, polish, oil, and time itself. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, holding rolls of thread, spools of wire, clamps, needles, rivets, buckles, scraps of hide folded and stacked by thickness and grain. The workbench bore scars from decades of careful labor, each nick and burn a record of patience rather than haste. Esther had spent most of her life repairing what others had discarded: purses, suitcases, briefcases, satchels, trunks. She had learned early that objects carried their histories in ways people often refused to. A broken clasp told a different story than a smile. A reinforced seam spoke of fear or foresight. Weight, balance, wear patterns, the way a handle had been gripped again and again by the same hand. These things did not lie. They did not pretend. They simply endured. Her hands were the most honest part of her. Darkened by age and work, marked by fine scars and calluses, they moved with the confidence of long practice. She did not rush. She examined before she touched before she altered. When she repaired something, she respected the intention behind its making, even when that intention had been careless or cruel. She believed that restoration was not about returning an object to what it once was, but about allowing it to continue existing with dignity. The neighborhood provided her with a steady stream of work. People brought her what they could not replace and could not afford to lose. Sometimes they paid her with cash, sometimes with favors, sometimes with silence and gratitude. She never advertised. Her reputation traveled quietly, passed along in kitchens, barbershops, church basements. Esther fixed things. She always had. What she rarely fixed were memories. Her father had worked at the steel plant less than 2 miles from their house. She could still picture him coming home in the evenings, his clothes smelling of heat and iron, his shoulders stooped not from weakness, but from exhaustion. He had died when she was young, his death explained in vague terms by paperwork and officials who'd never met her eyes. Complications, exposure, natural causes, words that closed doors rather than opened them. No lawsuit followed. No investigation lingered. The plant continued running. The neighborhood kept working. Life moved on because it had to. Esther learned then that truth was not always something that arrived on its own. Sometimes it had to be uncovered, coaxed out, read between lines and seams. Sometimes it never arrived at all. Over the years, she watched the neighborhood empty. Families moved away when the jobs vanished. Those who stayed grew older, quieter. Children became rare. The laughter that once spilled from stoops in summer was replaced by the hum of distant highways and the whistle of wind through broken glass. Yet Esther remained. She did not feel trapped. She felt rooted. Leaving would have meant severing herself from everything she understood. On Saturdays, when the weather allowed, she walked the surrounding streets in search of garage sales and yard clearances. These sales were less about profit than surrender. People selling off the remnants of lives they no longer wanted to carry. Furniture too heavy to move. Boxes of photographs no one could name. Tools whose owners were gone. Esther approached these gatherings with a practiced eye and a quiet respect. She knew the difference between junk and what had simply been abandoned too soon. That particular Saturday began like any other. The sky was overcast, heavy with the promise of rain that never quite arrived. Esther pulled on her coat, slipped a few bills into her pocket, and locked her door behind her. As she walked, her gaze drifted toward the distant outlines of factories rising like skeletons against the gray sky. She did not hurry. She never did. The garage sale sat at the edge of a block that had once housed dozens of plant workers. Now, only a handful of homes remained occupied. A fold-in table had been set up near the driveway, cluttered with mismatched items. Tools, old lamps, boxes of cables and hardware. The people browsing moved without urgency, their interest casual, detached. Esther approached slowly, scanning without appearing to search. Then she saw it. The bag sat on the ground near the back wall of the garage, half hidden behind a box of rusted pipes. It was old, that much was obvious. The metal frame had oxidized to a deep reddish brown, the leather panels darkened and stiff. The surface bore the marks of long storage in damp conditions. A faint smell of iron and mold lingered around it, strong enough that others avoided it instinctively. Esther did not. She knelt carefully and lifted the bag by its handle. The weight surprised her. Not because it was heavy, but because the weight was uneven. The bottom pulled downward with a subtle insistence, as though something inside resisted movement. She shifted it in her hands, feeling the distribution, the balance. Her fingers traced the seams along the base, lingering where the leather met metal. The bag was well made, older than it looked, not fashionable, not decorative, functional, purpose-built, and altered. She could not yet say how she knew that, only that something about it felt deliberate in a way most factory-made items did not. She set it down again and examined it from a distance, her eyes narrowing slightly. The others passed by without comment. Someone wrinkled their nose at the smell. The seller shrugged and named a price low enough to be insulting. Esther paid without bargaining. As she walked home, the bag rested against her side, its weight steady, almost patient. She did not open it. Not yet. She felt no rush. Whatever it held had waited this long. It could wait a little longer. The garage door creaked open later that afternoon, letting in the muted light of early evening. Esther set the bag on her workbench and removed her coat. She washed her hands carefully, a ritual that marked the beginning of work. When she returned, she stood over the bag in silence, studying it as one might study a face long unseen. Outside, the neighborhood remained still. Inside, something old and unresolved had quietly crossed the threshold. The bag did not leave Esther's thoughts that night. It remained on the workbench where she had placed it, unmoving, as if aware that its time had finally begun. She did not open it immediately, nor did she touch it again before evening settled fully over the neighborhood. Instead, she closed the garage, returned to the house, and went about the small routines that mark the end of her days. Dinner was simple and eaten slowly. The radio murmured in the background, its voices fading in and out through static. When she finally lay down to sleep, the image of the bag's uneven weight lingered in her mind, not as curiosity, but as recognition. Morning came without ceremony. The sky was a dull slate color, low clouds pressing down over the city. Esther rose early, as she always did, and moved through the house with a practiced familiarity. Yet something had shifted. The rhythm was the same, but the quiet carried a different density, as if the air itself were waiting. After breakfast, she did not go straight to the garage. Instead, she brewed another cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching a neighbor across the street load boxes into the trunk of a car. Another departure, another small erasure. She wondered, not for the first time, how many lives had passed through these houses, how many stories had ended without being told. The thought followed her when she finally stepped outside and crossed the yard. The garage smelled the same as always, but her attention went immediately to the workbench. The bag sat exactly where she had left it. In the clearer light of morning, its condition was even more apparent. The corrosion on the metal frame was advanced, layered, the kind that formed only after long exposure to moisture. The leather, once supple, had stiffened and cracked along the folds, darkened unevenly by years of neglect. Yet, beneath the damage, the craftsmanship remained evident. This had not been a cheap item. It had been designed to last. Esther circled the workbench before touching it, studying the bag from every angle. She crouched slightly, bringing her eyes level with the base. The bottom panel sat flatter than it should have, its rigidity inconsistent with the rest of the structure. She ran her fingers along the seam where the leather met the metal frame, noting variations in tension, tiny irregularities in stitch spacing. Not flaws exactly, but decisions. She lifted the bag again, this time closing her eyes as she shifted it from one hand to the other. The imbalance was subtle, but undeniable. Whatever lay inside was not loose. It was fixed in place, integrated into the structure itself. That realization settled heavily in her chest. Still, she did not open it. Esther had learned long ago that haste ruined more than it revealed. She cleared the workbench, setting aside the tools she would not need. She laid out clean cloths and arranged her solvents, brushes, and clamps. The preparation was deliberate, almost ceremonial. By the time she was ready, the bag no longer felt like a curiosity from a garage sale. It felt like a responsibility. She began with the exterior. Using a soft brush, she removed surface dust and debris, careful not to disturb the corrosion more than necessary. The smell intensified slightly as she worked, releasing notes of old metal, damp leather, and something deeper, more organic. She had encountered this before in items stored too long in basements and crawl spaces. It was the scent of time closed in on itself. As she cleaned, her attention remained fixed on the structure. The handle had been reinforced from the inside, the stitching heavier there than elsewhere. The side panels bore faint impressions, as if pressure had been applied repeatedly at specific points. This bag had been used with intention. It had carried something important, something heavy, not merely in weight, but in consequence. Only after the exterior was sufficiently cleaned did she open the clasp. The hinges protested, stiff with rust, but they yielded without breaking. The interior was lined with fabric that had once been light in color but had faded to a sickly gray. Mold had crept along the edges, softening the fibers. The interior cavity itself was empty. No loose contents, no immediate explanation for the weight. Esther exhaled slowly. This, too, was familiar. Secrets were rarely placed where they could be found by accident. She examined the lining closely, pressing gently along the sides and base. The fabric shifted unevenly beneath her fingers. There was give where there should have been firmness, resistance where softness was expected. The bottom lining in particular behaved strangely, sagging slightly before stopping abruptly, as if supported by something beneath it. She turned the bag over and examined the underside. The metal frame formed a rigid outline, but the leather panel within it seemed thicker than necessary. She measured it with her eyes, comparing it to similar bags she had restored in the past. The discrepancy was small but unmistakable. Someone had altered this bag. The realization did not bring excitement. It brought a quiet heaviness, the kind that settled in the stomach. Esther had restored altered items before. Smuggling compartments, hidden pockets, false bottoms, most were crude, hastily constructed. This was not. Whatever modification had been made here was careful, deliberate, and meant to last. She set the bag aside and cleaned her hands again, taking a moment to steady herself. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its tires crunching over loose gravel. The ordinary world continued, oblivious. Esther returned to the workbench and began to prepare for deeper restoration. She loosened the interior lining, working methodically, careful not to tear fabric that was already fragile. As she lifted the lining along the sides, she confirmed that the anomaly was confined to the base. The walls were original. Only the bottom had been changed. She pressed gently at the center of the base and felt a firm surface beneath the leather. Not wood, not metal. Something else. She tapped it lightly with her knuckle and listened. The sound was dull, absorbed, encased. Her heart rate increased, though her hands remained steady. She had reached the point of no return. To proceed would mean dismantling part of the bag permanently. Whatever she found, she would not be able to unsee it. Esther considered stopping. She considered resealing the lining and returning the bag to the state in which she had found it. There was no obligation to know, no requirement to uncover what had been hidden. Yet the thought of leaving it untouched felt wrong, like sealing a door that had already begun to open. She reached for her tools. The work that followed was slow and precise. She removed the lining from the base entirely, revealing a second layer of leather beneath. This layer was darker, thicker, and stitched with a different thread. The stitching was tight, uniform, and done by hand. Each stitch was placed with care, the spacing consistent, the tension perfect. Whoever had sewn this was not an amateur. They had wanted the work to disappear, to look like a part of the original structure. Esther traced the stitches with her finger, following the path they took around the perimeter of the base. There was no obvious opening, no loose thread to pull. The compartment had been sealed completely. She leaned back, studying the bag as a whole. The garage was quiet except for the faint hum of electricity from a single overhead light. Dust motes drifted through the air. Time seemed to slow, stretching the moment. This was not a sluchai hiding place. This was a container built to endure scrutiny, built to survive. Esther understood then that the bag had not been abandoned because it was worthless. It had been abandoned because it was dangerous. Because time had rendered it inconvenient, its purpose forgotten by those who could no longer remember why it mattered. She tightened her grip on the edge of the workbench and steadied her breathing. Whatever lay beneath that second layer of leather had waded through decades of neglect, through the decline of a city, through the passing of generations. It had survived moisture, mold, and rust. It had survived being overlooked at a garage sale by everyone except a woman who could read the language of seams. Esther did not yet cut into the leather. Not today. Instead, she covered the bag carefully and shut off the light. Some things, she knew, demanded preparation beyond tools. They demanded resolve. As she closed the garage door and returned to the house, the sense of inevitability followed her. The bag had entered her life quietly, without spectacle. But it had not arrived by chance. And soon, very soon, it would no longer be silent. The decision had been made the moment Esther covered the bag and turned off the light. She felt it the next morning before she even reached the garage, a steady resolve that had replaced hesitation. Whatever lay beneath that second layer of leather was no longer a question of curiosity. It was a matter of craft, of responsibility to the object itself. She had restored countless items over the years, each with its own resistance, its own quiet demands. This bag was no different, except in the weight it carried beyond its physical form. She unlocked the garage just after sunrise. Pale light filtered through the small windows, settling across the workbench in muted bands. The bag waited where she had left it, covered with clean cloth. Esther removed the cloth slowly, as though unveiling something fragile. She did not rush. Restoration, to her, was not an act of force, but of listening. Before touching the bag again, she prepared her space. Tools were arranged with care, each placed where her hand expected to find it. Knives were sharpened, not to a razor's edge but to a controlled precision. Needles were selected by thickness and flexibility. Thread was measured and set aside, though she suspected she would not need it until the very end. The solvents she chose were mild, meant to loosen without dissolving. She had learned the hard way that impatience destroyed more than time ever did. When she finally lifted the bag, she felt its resistance again, the subtle pull at the base. She placed it flat on the bench and examined the underside once more. In the clearer light, the differences were even more apparent. The leather of the base was not only thicker, but older than the rest, its surface marked by wear that did not match the bag's exterior. This piece had been repurposed, salvaged perhaps from another item entirely. It had been chosen for durability, not appearance. Esther ran her fingers along the hand-stitched seam, counting the stitches without conscious effort. The spacing was consistent, the tension even. No machine had done this. The person who sewed it had taken their time, had known exactly how much pressure to apply to avoid puckering the leather. This was not hurried work. This was careful, almost reverent. She began by softening the leather. Using a damp cloth treated with conditioner, she worked the surface slowly, allowing moisture to penetrate just enough to make the fibers pliable. The smell of old hide rose gently, mixing with the ever-present scent of metal. As she worked, her mind drifted briefly to other restorations, other hidden compartments she had uncovered over the years. Most had been crude, designed to conceal cash or small valuables for short periods. This felt different. This felt permanent. Once the leather had softened, she tested the seam with the tip of her knife, not cutting, only pressing lightly to feel how the thread responded. It did not give easily. Whoever had sewn it had chosen a thread meant to last, waxed and strong. Cutting it would not be simple, and once cut, it could not be replaced without leaving evidence of intervention. Esther paused, knife hovering just above the seam. She closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. This was the moment where restoration crossed into revelation. She reminded herself that the object had already been altered. She was not the first to break its original form. She was merely continuing a process that had begun long before it reached her hands. She made the first cut carefully, slicing through a single stitch. The sound was barely audible, a soft whisper against leather. She did not rush to cut the next. Instead, she tested the leather, gently lifting where the stitch had been severed. There was resistance beneath, firm and unmoving. Whatever lay below was encased tightly. She continued, cutting stitch by stitch, working her way along one side of the base. The process took time. Each cut was deliberate, each movement controlled. Her hands did not tremble, but her awareness sharpened. The garage seemed quieter than usual, as though the space itself were holding its breath. When enough of the seam had been opened, she carefully pried the leather back. Beneath it lay a second surface, smooth and dark. Not leather this time, but something else entirely. She touched it with her fingertips, recognizing the texture immediately. Waxed paper, layered and compressed. Old but intact. Her heart quickened despite herself. She peeled back more of the leather, revealing the full extent of the compartment. It was shallow but wide, occupying nearly the entire base of the bag. The waxed paper lining had been folded and sealed with care, forming a tight envelope fitted precisely to the space. This had not been improvised, it had been engineered. Esther did not open the packet yet. Instead, she examined how it had been integrated into the bag's structure. The compartment had been reinforced with a thin internal frame, likely added to support the additional weight. The bag had not been designed to carry this load originally, but the modifications had compensated for that. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Whoever had done this had known both the limitations of the object and how to overcome them. She removed the packet from the compartment slowly, supporting it with both hands. It was heavier than it looked, dense and solid. The waxed paper was discolored with age, but showed no signs of having been breached. Whatever was inside had been protected from moisture and air for a very long time. Esther set the packet on the bench and turned her attention back to the bag. The interior cavity above the compartment was still empty, confirming her earlier suspicion. The bag had been designed to appear innocuous even if opened. Its true purpose lay hidden beneath the lining, inaccessible without deliberate dismantling. she felt a flicker of admiration for the mind that had conceived this. Not admiration for what they had hidden, which she did not yet know, but for the foresight required to hide it so well. This was not the work of someone acting on impulse. This was the work of someone who anticipated scrutiny, who planned for time to pass. With the packet removed, Esther examined the compartment itself. There were no markings, no notes, nothing to indicate its contents. The space was clean, orderly. It had been sealed with the expectation that it would remain sealed indefinitely. That it now lay open felt like a violation of intent, though she could not say why. She returned her attention to the packet. The waxed paper was folded multiple times, its edges pressed flat and sealed with heat. There were no labels, no writing. The anonymity was complete. This was not meant to be found casually. This was meant to be preserved. Esther weighed the packet in her hands, feeling its balance, its density. It did not feel like a single object, but a collection, stacked and compressed. Paper, perhaps, or something heavier. She did not shake it. She had no desire to disturb its internal order. Before opening it, she cleaned the workbench thoroughly, removing any debris that might contaminate the contents. She washed her hands again, drying them carefully. These small rituals mattered to her. They marked respect, both for the object and for herself. She sat for a long moment, the packet resting on the bench between her hands. The garage was quiet except for the distant sounds of the city waking up. Somewhere, a truck engine turned over. A dog barked and fell silent. Life continued, unaware of the threshold she had reached. Esther thought of her father then, the way his lunch pail had always been heavier on some days than others. She remembered the weight of it when she carried it to him once as a child, how it had pulled at her arm. She remembered asking him why it was so heavy, and his vague answer meant to reassure rather than explain. She had not questioned it further. Children learned quickly when questions were unwelcome. The memory faded, leaving behind a familiar ache. She did not open the packet yet. There would be time for that. First, she needed to understand what she was dealing with, to prepare herself for the possibility that the contents would not be simple or benign. Objects like this did not hide trivial things. Esther turned back to the bag and began the process of stabilizing it. The compartment would need to be resealed eventually, though not yet. She supported the opened seam with temporary stitching, ensuring the structure would not collapse. She treated the exposed leather with conditioner to prevent cracking. These actions grounded her, reminding her that whatever else this bag represented, it was still an object under her care. As the morning wore on, light shifted across the garage, casting longer shadows. Esther worked steadily, her movements measured. By the time she finished stabilizing the bag, the day had advanced further than she realized. She looked at the packet again, then at the clock on the wall. Not today, she decided. Some discoveries demanded more than daylight. She placed the packet in a clean drawer beneath the workbench, one she reserved for items awaiting final restoration. She locked the drawer, a habit more than a necessity. Then she covered the bag once more and turned off the light. As she closed the garage door behind her, the sense of inevitability returned, stronger now. The bag had yielded its first secret, but it was only the beginning. Whatever had been sealed away beneath layers of leather and wax had survived because it was meant to. And now that it had been uncovered, it would not remain silent for long. The packet did not remain untouched for long. Even as Esther went about the rest of her day, its presence followed her with a quiet insistence, as if the object itself were aware that concealment had ended and purpose was drawing near. She slept lightly that night, waking more than once with the sense that something unresolved lay just beyond her reach. By morning, the decision she had postponed no longer felt optional. The packet had been protected for decades. It deserved to be seen. She returned to the garage earlier than usual, the light still pale and uncertain. The space felt different now, charged in a way she could not entirely explain. She unlocked the drawer beneath the workbench and removed the packet with both hands, setting it down on a clean cloth. The waxed paper had stiffened with age, and its surface dulled and faintly mottled, but it remained intact. She examined the folds carefully, noting how they overlapped with precision, each crease pressed flat with intention. This was not the hurried wrapping of someone improvising. This was preservation. Esther adjusted the lamp above the bench, angling the light so it fell evenly across the packet. She brought out a magnifying glass and examined the edges where the wax had been sealed. There were no markings, no signatures, no dates. The anonymity was complete, and that in itself told a story. Whoever had sealed this had not wanted credit nor discovery. They had wanted endurance. She warmed the tip of a small blade just enough to soften the wax without scorching it. Slowly, patiently, she traced the edge of the seal, allowing the wax to yield. The smell that rose was faint but distinct, a dry, aged scent like old books stored too long in a closed room. She peeled the paper back layer by layer, each fold releasing reluctantly, as though resisting exposure. The contents emerged gradually. First, a stack of paper, thick and neatly aligned, then something heavier beneath it, its outline pressing against the remaining layers. Esther set the waxed paper aside and focused on what lay before her. The papers were old but remarkably well preserved. Their edges had yellowed and some bore faint stains, but the ink remained legible, the text crisp. She lifted the top page and recognized the format immediately. Reports. Typed, not handwritten. Official in tone, though not in origin. Names, dates, figures, margins filled with notes written in a careful hand. She read slowly, absorbing without rushing. The documents detailed workplace incidents, injuries, fatalities. Each entry followed a similar structure, clinical and detached. Location, time, cause, resolution. But, as she read further, patterns began to emerge. Incidents clustered around certain facilities. Causes repeated with suspicious frequency. Resolutions were uniformly brief, dismissive, no follow-up, no accountability. Beneath the reports were copies of internal memos. These were more revealing. Conversations between executives, plant managers, legal counsel. Discussions of liability, of public perception, of cost-benefit analyses that reduced human lives to columns of numbers. The language was cautious, coded, but the intent was unmistakable. Problems were to be minimized, not solved. Exposure was to be managed, not prevented. Esther felt a tightening in her chest as she turned page after page. This was not negligence. This was design. She reached the heavier object beneath the papers and lifted it carefully. It was a leather wallet, worn but sturdy, its surface softened by years of use. She opened it and found a badge tucked into one side. A private investigator's shield, tarnished but intact. The name engraved beneath the emblem was unfamiliar, but the weight of it felt significant. This was not an ornament. It was proof of authority, of intent to investigate. Behind the badge were folded newspaper clippings, their headlines stark even after decades. Reports of factory accidents, mysterious illnesses, sudden deaths attributed to natural causes, and then, abruptly, a different kind of article. a short piece announcing the disappearance of a private investigator hired to look into industrial safety violations. The article was brief, almost dismissive. No suspects, no leads, case unresolved. Esther set the wallet down and leaned back slightly, allowing the pieces to settle into place. The bag, the hidden compartment, the packet, the documents, the badge. They formed a single narrative now, clear and unsettling. This bag had not belonged to a worker or a victim. It had belonged to someone who had chosen to look too closely at things powerful people preferred to keep obscured. She returned to the papers, reading more carefully now, cross-referencing dates and locations. The reports aligned with the period when the factories in her neighborhood had been at their busiest, when the streets had been full, when the houses had been occupied, when the air had carried a metallic tang that no one questioned because it meant work, and work meant survival. As she read, certain addresses caught her eye. Streets she recognized, blocks she had walked countless times. She noted them mentally, a growing unease settling over her. This was no distant history. This was her history, written in the language of bureaucracy and concealment. She reached the bottom of the stack and found another item, smaller but no less deliberate. A folded map drawn by hand on thick paper. The lines were precise, the markings careful. It depicted a section of the city, industrial zones highlighted, routes traced and retraced. Certain sites were circled, annotated with symbols she did not immediately understand. But the intention was clear. This was a guide, a record of movement and observation. Esther spread the map out fully, smoothing it with her hands. She recognized landmarks immediately. Old rail lines, abandoned lots, facilities that had since been demolished or sealed. The map was both a snapshot in time and a tool meant to outlast it. She sat with the contents for a long while, the garage silent around her. The magnitude of what she held pressed in from all sides. This was evidence, not circumstantial, not speculative. Evidence gathered with care and preserved against the erosion of time. Evidence that had been hidden not because it was unimportant, but because it was dangerous. The realization brought with it a familiar, bitter recognition. She had seen this pattern before, not in documents, but in lives. In neighbors who grew sick too young. In men who left for work and did not return. In explanations that never quite explained anything. Esther gathered the papers and began sorting them methodically, grouping reports by facility, by date, by incident type. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, her mind cataloging connections. As she worked, a sense of grim clarity took hold. This was not a single crime. It was a system, operating quietly for years, shielded by money, influence, and indifference. She thought of the private investigator then, not as a name on a badge, but as a person. Someone who had chosen to see what others ignored. Someone who had gathered this material knowing the risk. Someone who had hidden it not in a safe or an office, but in a bag designed to travel unnoticed, to survive being lost, discarded, forgotten. The bag had done its job. Esther felt a wave of anger rise, slow and heavy, not the sharp kind that demanded immediate action, but the deep, enduring kind that came from long familiarity with injustice. She had lived long enough to know that truth did not guarantee resolution. That exposure did not always lead to accountability. But she had also learned that silence guaranteed nothing but repetition. She carefully returned the documents to the cloth, stacking them neatly. The wallet and badge she placed on top. The map she folded last, its creases aligning perfectly as though it remembered its shape. She did not rewrap them yet. There was more to understand. Before closing the drawer, she took one last look at the empty compartment in the bag. It seemed almost to watch her. Its purpose fulfilled, but its presence still charged with meaning. This space had held the weight of truth for decades. Now that weight had shifted to her. Esther closed the drawer and locked it, her movements steady. She turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the dimness of the garage, listening to the faint sounds of the city beyond the walls. Cars passed. Somewhere, a siren wailed briefly before fading. Life continued, indifferent to the revelation that had just occurred in a small, forgotten space. As she stepped back into the house, she felt the past pressing closer, no longer distant or abstract. It had taken form, ink and paper and leather and wax. It had waited patiently, confident that eventually someone would understand what to do with it. And now it had found that person. The knowledge that had surfaced from the packet did not disperse once the drawer was closed. It lingered in Esther's thoughts with a weight that made ordinary tasks feel strangely distant. Even as she went through the motions of her day, sorting tools, wiping down surfaces, preparing materials for future repairs, her mind returned again and again to the documents resting beneath the workbench. They were no longer inert objects. They were voices that had been held in check for decades, waiting for the moment when they could be heard. By the following morning, Esther understood that simply knowing what the papers contained was not enough. They demanded to be read fully, carefully, in order, and with the patience they had been granted by time. She returned to the garage with a stack of notebooks, clean sheets of paper, and a sharpened pencil. The habits of her craft guided her. Just as she never restored an object without understanding its structure, she would not confront this history without mapping it completely. She unlocked the drawer and removed the contents, laying them out across the bench in a broad, deliberate arrangement. The reports formed the largest portion, their uniform appearance suggesting a bureaucracy that thrived on repetition. Each document followed the same template, the language precise and restrained, as though emotion itself had been edited out. Injuries were described in technical terms. Deaths were reduced to incidents. Responsibility was diffuse, always assigned to circumstances rather than decisions. Esther read from the beginning, tracing the timeline as it unfolded. The earliest reports dated back to a period when Detroit's factories had been operating at full capacity, when production quotas were pushed higher each year, when safety measures were discussed as inconveniences rather than necessities. The documents referenced facilities by internal codes rather than names, but she quickly learned to recognize which was which by cross-checking addresses and contextual details. Each code corresponded to a place she had known, or at least known of. Buildings that now stood abandoned had once been sites of relentless activity. As she moved forward through the years, patterns became impossible to ignore. Similar accidents repeated across different locations, always attributed to worker error, equipment failure, or unavoidable conditions. Yet the memos that followed told a different story. Internal correspondence revealed awareness of faulty machinery, of hazardous materials, of corners cut to meet deadlines and reduce costs. Discussions centered not on preventing harm, but on minimizing exposure. How to phrase reports. How to limit inspections. How to settle quietly when settlements could not be avoided. Esther felt a familiar tightening in her chest as she read. She had heard these justifications before, though never so plainly. She had heard them in the resigned voices of widows, in the evasive explanations given to families, in the careful wording of official statements that never quite addressed the questions being asked. Seeing them laid out so methodically stripped away any remaining illusion that these outcomes had been accidental. She turned to the handwritten notes in the margins, written in a steady, disciplined hand. The private investigator's presence was strongest here. Questions had been added where reports fell silent. Names circled, dates underlined, connections drawn between incidents separated by months or years. The handwriting did not grow frantic or emotional, even as the implications deepened. It remained controlled, as though the writer understood that clarity would be their greatest defense. Esther followed these notes like a guide, allowing them to direct her attention to specific documents. In doing so, she began to see the investigation not as a collection of isolated findings, but as a coherent effort to expose a system. The investigator had not been chasing a single incident. They had been building a case, brick by brick, document by document, against an entire corporate structure. The map proved invaluable in this process. Esther unfolded it again and laid it beside the reports, aligning locations with dates. She traced routes with her finger, imagining the investigator moving through the city, observing, recording, returning again and again to the same sites. Certain facilities appeared repeatedly, marked more heavily than others. These were the places where the worst incidents had occurred, where the pattern was most pronounced. One address, in particular, drew her attention. It was a plant less than a mile from her home, one that had closed abruptly decades earlier and remained fenced off ever since. She remembered the day it shut down, the suddenness of it, the confusion. Workers sent home with vague assurances that never materialized. She remembered how the neighborhood had shifted afterward, how families struggled, how illness seemed to take root in ways no one could quite explain. She searched through the reports until she found the entries corresponding to that facility. There were more than she had expected. Injuries, chemical exposure, respiratory issues, and then one report that made her hands still. The date aligned with a memory she had carried for years, though she had never connected it to anything beyond personal loss. Her father's name appeared in the margin of a report, not as a primary subject but as a reference. A co-worker injured in the same incident. A witness statement noted, then dismissed. The report concluded quickly, attributing the cause to operator error. No further action required. Esther closed her eyes briefly, the weight of it settling in. She had not expected to find him here, not explicitly. Yet the recognition did not surprise her. It explained too much. The long decline of his health, the unexplained symptoms, the way his strength had faded without clear cause, the official explanations that had never satisfied but had gone unchallenged because there was no energy left to fight. She returned to the documents with a renewed focus, reading more carefully now, more slowly. Each page added another layer to the understanding forming in her mind. This was not merely a history of corporate misconduct. It was a ledger of lives altered and ended, of communities shaped by decisions made far from their reach. The money found in the compartment took on new meaning as she read further. Notes attached to certain memos referenced payments, settlements, discretionary funds. The amounts were substantial, yet always framed as costs of doing business. The presence of the cash alongside the documents suggested a different purpose. This was not profit. This was leverage. Proof that offers had been made, that silence had been purchased when possible and resisted when not. The private investigator's disappearance fit neatly into this framework. The final documents in the stack showed an escalation in concern from corporate officials, their tone sharpening, their language more urgent. References to legal exposure increased. The last memo was brief, almost terse, noting that further inquiry was unnecessary and that the matter would be handled internally. After that, there was nothing. No reports, no notes. The trail ended abruptly. Esther leaned back from the bench, her pencil resting forgotten beside her notebook. The scope of what she held was staggering, yet it was also intimate in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. This was her neighborhood, her family, her history. The papers did not speak in abstractions, they spoke in addresses she knew, names she recognized, losses she had lived with. She began to organize her notes, grouping incidents by location and time, mapping the progression of harm. As she worked, a sense of grim clarity took hold. The investigator had been close to something decisive when they vanished. The evidence suggested that they had intended to bring these findings into the open, to force accountability. The bag, the compartment, the packet had been a contingency, a last safeguard against erasure. Esther understood then that the bag had not simply belonged to the investigator. It had been entrusted with their unfinished work. It had been designed to outlast them. The realization brought with it a heavy responsibility. She was no investigator, no lawyer, no journalist. She was a woman who repaired things, who made damaged objects usable again. Yet, perhaps that was precisely why the burden had come to rest with her. She knew how to handle what others discarded. She knew how to restore what had been broken, even when the damage ran deep. As the afternoon light shifted across the garage, Esther continued her work, methodically piecing together the story that had been hidden beneath layers of leather and wax. Each connection she made reinforced the same conclusion. This history had been buried not because it was forgotten, but because it was feared. By the time she carefully stacked the documents again, the truth they contained had settled into her with a quiet, unyielding certainty. The past was no longer distant. It had reached into her present, demanding acknowledgement. She folded the map once more and placed it atop the papers, the wallet and badge resting beside it. Before returning them to the drawer, she paused, her hand lingering over the stack. This was no longer just evidence of wrongdoing. It was a record of endurance, of one person's refusal to let truth vanish quietly. Esther closed the drawer gently, as though sealing not an object but a promise. She knew now that what she had uncovered could not remain confined to her garage. The papers had waited long enough, and so, in their own way, had she. The certainty that settled over Esther after reading the papers did not bring relief. It brought weight. Knowledge, once acquired, demanded a response, and this knowledge was too deeply entwined with her own life to be treated as distant history. The drawer beneath the workbench now held more than documents. It held a version of her past that she had never been given the language to articulate, a framework that explained losses she had learned to accept without understanding. She moved through the following days with a deliberate slowness, as though any sudden movement might disturb the fragile alignment that had formed between memory and fact. The garage remained her refuge, yet even there the familiar smells and textures felt altered. Every scrape of leather, every metallic tang in the air, reminded her of what she now knew lay beneath the surface of things. She found herself pausing often, her hands resting idle as her thoughts drifted backward. Her father's presence returned to her in fragments, rather than in a single coherent memory. The sound of his boots at the door in the evenings, the way he washed his hands at the sink, the water running dark before it cleared. His habit of sitting quietly at the table after dinner, shoulders slumped not from defeat, but from a fatigue that seemed to sink into his bones. At the time, she had understood none of it. It was simply how life was. Work was hard. Men aged quickly. Bodies failed. Now, those memories rearranged themselves, taking on new meaning. The cough he developed that never quite went away. The headaches he dismissed. The days he stayed home, lying on the couch with his eyes closed, insisting he would be fine by morning. The way her mother's worry had sharpened into something quieter and more constant, a vigilance that never found release. Esther had accepted his death as something inevitable, a private grief folded into the larger fabric of the neighborhood's losses. She had not questioned the official explanation because there had been no language for questioning, no documents, no proof, just a sense that asking would lead nowhere. And so she had learned, as so many did, to carry on. The papers had given her that language at last. She returned to them again, not to analyze the broader scheme, but to trace the thread that led directly to her own life. She found the report again, the one that referenced her father in passing. The words were clinical, impersonal, but they burned nonetheless. Witness statement noted. No further action. She imagined him standing there, perhaps speaking up, perhaps pointing out something that did not align with the official narrative. She imagined how quickly that voice would have been absorbed into paperwork, neutralized by procedure. Other names followed, some familiar, some only vaguely remembered. Men who had lived on her street, fathers of friends, neighbors who had stopped appearing at church without explanation. The papers transformed these absences into something tangible, connecting them through a web of decisions made far beyond their control. Esther felt anger then, not sharp or explosive, but deep and enduring. It was the kind of anger that had nowhere to go when it first formed, that had settled into resignation over time. Now it resurfaced, altered by clarity. This was not misfortune. This was not bad luck. This was choice. She confronted another truth as well, one that unsettled her more than she expected. Her survival, her relative health, had not been guaranteed. It had been contingent. The same forces that had shaped her father's fate had brushed against her life, sparing her not through intention but through circumstance. The randomness of it left her uneasy. It meant that the line between those who endured and those who did not had been thin, arbitrary. This realization reframed her understanding of herself. She had long considered her work with discarded objects a response to scarcity, to the need to make do in a world that offered little excess. Now she saw another layer. She had been drawn to preservation, to restoration, because loss had been so pervasive, because so much had been taken without explanation. Repairing things had been her way of asserting continuity, of refusing erasure in the small domains she could control. The investigator's presence loomed larger in her thoughts as well. She imagined the person behind the meticulous handwriting, the steady accumulation of evidence. Someone who had chosen to step into the spaces where harm was normalized, to ask questions that others avoided. Someone who had not been protected by their badge or their carefulness. The realization that this person had disappeared not by chance, but by consequence sharpened her sense of responsibility. Esther recognized the parallel between their paths. Both had noticed patterns others ignored. Both had trusted their observations over official narratives. The difference lay in the risk they faced. The investigator had confronted power directly and paid for it. Esther now held the remnants of that confrontation, preserved by chance and craft. The weight of choice pressed in on her. She could close the drawer and return to her work, carrying this knowledge privately, allowing it to settle into memory without action. The past would remain exposed only to her, its truths acknowledged but unshared. It would be safer, quieter. It would also be a betrayal. She wrestled with this silently, pacing the garage, then the house, then the small yard behind it. The neighborhood watched her in its usual stillness. Nothing outward had changed. The factories remained silent. The houses remained weathered. The street remained empty. Yet everything felt different to her now, charged with an urgency she could not ignore. Esther understood that she was not driven by vengeance. The people responsible were likely gone or insulated by time and distance. What she felt was closer to obligation. The truth had survived this long because someone had believed it mattered. That belief had not expired with them. She returned to the garage and sat at the workbench, resting her hands on the worn wood. The bag stood nearby, its altered base concealed once more beneath temporary stitching. It had done its job faithfully, protecting what it carried until it reached someone capable of understanding it. In that sense, the bag mirrored her own life. It had endured. It had waited. Esther's thoughts turned to the living as well as the dead, to the families who had never received answers, to the children who had grown up with absences they could not name, to a neighborhood shaped by invisible decisions. Silence had not spared them. It had only prolonged uncertainty. The choice clarified itself gradually, not as a dramatic decision but as an acceptance of inevitability. She would not allow this truth to remain buried again. She would not let the investigators' work dissolve into another forgotten drawer, another sealed compartment. She did not yet know how she would act, only that inaction was no longer possible. As evening approached, she gathered the documents once more, not to study them, but to acknowledge them as part of her own story now. She traced the edges of the papers lightly, a gesture of respect rather than possession. These were not hers, yet they had found her. That, she understood, carried meaning. Esther closed the drawer and locked it, the sound of the key turning firm and final. The lock was not meant to keep others out. It was meant to mark a boundary until the right moment arrived. She turned off the lights and stepped outside, the cool air brushing her face. The neighborhood lay quiet around her, unchanged in appearance, yet altered irrevocably in her understanding. She looked towards the dark outlines of the abandoned factories and felt no nostalgia, only clarity. The past had reached forward, placing its weight in her hands. She would carry it, not as a burden, but as a responsibility that had been delayed long enough. The decision, once accepted, did not bring with it a clear path forward. Esther knew what she would not do, but what remained was vast and uncertain. She did not belong to the world of law or media. She had no formal authority, no institutional protection. What she possessed was patience, discipline, and an understanding of how fragments could be made to speak when arranged with care. If the investigation was to be completed, it would be done the only way she knew how. Slowly, methodically, and with respect for the material itself. She began by turning her garage into something closer to an archive. The workbench became a table of reference rather than repair. Clean sheets of paper covered its surface, weighted at the corners. She brought in additional lamps, adjusting them until every inch of the space was evenly lit. The documents were laid out not as a stack, but as a field, each page placed deliberately so its relationship to the others could be seen. This was no longer about reading, it was about structure. Esther worked in silence, allowing herself no shortcuts. She numbered each document, noting dates, locations, and names. She copied key passages by hand into her notebooks, not trusting machines to preserve what had already survived one erasure. Writing slowed her thinking, forced her to absorb rather than skim. As she wrote, patterns sharpened, timelines aligned, gaps became visible. The reports that once seemed repetitive now revealed escalation. Incidents grew more severe over time, their consequences more lethal. Internal memos shifted in tone, moving from cautious dismissal to calculated suppression. References to regulatory bodies appeared and disappeared, replaced by discussions of influence and negotiation. What had begun as neglect had evolved into strategy. The map became central to her understanding. She pinned a large sheet of paper to the wall and began reproducing it at scale, transferring each marked location with careful precision. Lines were drawn to connect sites that shared incident dates. Symbols were replicated exactly as they appeared. When she stepped back, the result was unmistakable. The harm was not random. It followed infrastructure, supply chains, waste routes. The very arteries that had sustained the city's industrial life had also carried its poison. Esther marked her own neighborhood on the map, then expanded outward. The cluster of incidents around it was dense, overlapping. She felt again the quiet shock of recognition. This was the center of something, not the periphery. The people who had lived and died here had not been unfortunate bystanders. They had been placed deliberately where consequences could be absorbed without resistance. She turned next to the investigator's notes, treating them with particular care. These were the connective tissue of the entire archive, the mind behind the accumulation. She traced their progression, noting how early questions grew sharper, more pointed. The handwriting remained consistent, disciplined, even as the implications deepened. There was no sign of panic, only resolve. The final notes were the most revealing. They referenced meetings that had not appeared in any official records, conversations held outside formal channels, offers made, then refused. The language was sparse, but its meaning was clear. A line had been crossed. After that, the notes stopped. Esther did not speculate about the investigator's fate beyond what the evidence suggested. She had learned that imagination, while powerful, could also distort. The facts were sufficient. A person had gathered proof of wrongdoing that threatened powerful interests. That person had disappeared. The work had been hidden rather than destroyed, sealed away in a form meant to survive discovery by someone capable of understanding it. Her task now was not to solve what had happened to the investigator, but to ensure that their work reached beyond the limits imposed on them. Completion, she understood, did not mean closure. It meant continuation. She began preparing the materials for transfer, though she did not yet know to whom. Each document was placed in a protective sleeve. Copies were made by hand where possible, key sections transcribed verbatim. She organized everything into coherent sequences, ensuring that anyone encountering the archive would be able to follow its logic without her presence. As the days passed, the weight of the task settled into her body. She slept less, rising before dawn to work in the quiet hours when concentration came most easily. Meals became perfunctory, yet she did not feel depleted. The work sustained her in a way she had not anticipated. This was restoration of a different kind, the mending of a narrative that had been torn apart and scattered. When the time came to consider who should receive the materials, Esther chose deliberately. She did not trust institutions reflexively. she trusted individuals who understood the value of evidence and the cost of ignoring it. She reached out quietly without announcing herself or her findings. The initial contact was cautious, framed not as an accusation but as an offering of information that demanded careful handling. The response, when it came, was measured. Questions were asked, clarifications requested. Esther answered only what was necessary, providing proof incrementally. She had learned that truth, when presented too abruptly, could provoke defensiveness rather than action. Patience, again, was her ally. Eventually, arrangements were made. The transfer would not be dramatic. No public confrontation, no spectacle. The materials would be examined, verified, cross-checked against surviving records. Investigations would reopen not as acts of retribution, but as acknowledgments of responsibility long deferred. The day she prepared the final package, Esther felt a stillness she had not known in years. She laid out the documents one last time, checking each against her notes. The wallet and badge were included, their presence a reminder that this work had begun with a single person's refusal to look away. The map was folded carefully, its creases aligning as they always had. She placed everything into a new container, one designed not for concealment but for preservation. The old bag remained on the workbench, empty now, its secret compartment resealed but no longer burdened. It looked lighter somehow, as though relieved of its duty. When the materials left her hands, there was no immediate sense of triumph. There was only release. The work had moved beyond her. Whatever followed would unfold according to forces larger than her control. That was as it should be. In the weeks that followed, signs of change appeared quietly. Requests for additional information, notices of reopened inquiries, journalistic interest that grew steadily rather than explosively. The story, when it emerged, did so not as a single revelation, but as a series of confirmations, each reinforcing the last. The past was being reassembled piece by piece. Esther watched from a distance, her involvement largely invisible. She returned to her usual work, repairing bags, restoring what others discarded. The garage resumed its familiar rhythms. Yet, beneath the routine, something fundamental had shifted. The silence that once surrounded the neighborhood's history had been broken. She did not seek recognition. That had never been the point. What mattered was that the truth no longer belonged solely to memory or rumor. It had entered the record, imperfect but undeniable. The investigation, begun decades earlier and cut short, had reached its intended destination at last. And with that, Esther understood that her role was nearly complete. The final act remained, not in the public sphere, but in the quiet space where it had all begun. The garage felt different once the documents were gone. It was not emptier in any physical sense, yet the absence was unmistakable. The drawer beneath the workbench no longer carried the quiet pressure it once had, no longer held a history that strained against its confines. What remained was the familiar space of Esther's life, stripped of the burden that had occupied it for weeks, perhaps longer in ways she could not measure. The silence was cleaner now, less expectant. She stood for a long time near the workbench without touching anything, allowing herself to register the change. The work that had consumed her was finished, not because every consequence had played out, but because her part in it had been completed. The rest would unfold elsewhere, carried forward by people and processes beyond her reach. That understanding brought no regret. It brought balance. Her gaze settled on the bag. It rested where it always had, its shape unchanged, its surface still marked by rust and age. Yet now it appeared almost ordinary again, reduced from vessel of truth to object once more. The compartment in its base had been carefully resealed days earlier, not in an attempt to restore secrecy, but to restore integrity. Esther had taken her time with it, replacing damaged leather with material matched as closely as possible in age and texture, reinforcing the structure without erasing its history. The repair was discreet, respectful. Anyone who examined the bag casually would see only wear, not intervention. This, she knew, was the final act. Esther approached the workbench and laid out her tools with the same care she always had. Needle, thread, awl, clamps. The motions were familiar, grounding. She selected a thread slightly darker than the leather, strong but flexible, one that would age naturally with the bag rather than stand apart from it. She threaded the needle slowly, her hands steady, her breathing even. As she worked, her thoughts did not drift back to the investigation or the revelations it had brought. Instead, they settled on the rhythm of the stitch itself, the way the needle pierced the leather, the resistance, then the release, the quiet pull of the thread drawing the pieces together. Each stitch was placed deliberately, not too tight, not too loose, following the path that already existed, rather than imposing a new one. She had learned long ago that the best repairs did not announce themselves. They supported what was already there, allowing the object to continue its life without disruption. This was not erasure. It was continuity. Outside the garage, the afternoon light shifted gradually toward evening. The neighborhood remained still, its silence no longer oppressive but neutral, as though it too had released something it had been holding. The abandoned factories stood as they always had, but Esther no longer felt their presence as heavily. They were part of the landscape, not the center of her understanding. The final stitch came without ceremony. Esther secured the thread, trimmed it cleanly, and smoothed the leather with her palm. She examined the seam closely, then from a distance. The repair blended seamlessly into the bag's existing wear. Time would continue its work, softening edges, deepening color, but the structure was sound. The bag could endure. She cleaned her tools and set them back in their places. The routine mattered. It marked completion. For a moment, she considered what to do with the bag itself. It had served a purpose beyond anything it had been designed for. It had carried truth across decades, across neglect and chance, until it reached someone able to understand it. Now, that purpose was fulfilled. Keeping it felt neither necessary nor burdensome. Letting it go did not feel like loss. Esther placed the bag on a shelf among other restored items, not separated, not elevated. It became, once again, what it appeared to be, an old bag, repaired and preserved, waiting quietly for whatever came next. Perhaps it would be sold. Perhaps given away. Perhaps it would sit there for years, its history unknown to whoever eventually carried it. That anonymity felt appropriate. She turned off the overhead light and sat for a while in the dimness, listening to the faint sounds of the city. Somewhere, traffic moved along distant roads. A train horn sounded briefly, then faded. These were ordinary sounds, unremarkable, yet they felt newly distinct to her, as though the world had sharpened now that a long-standing distortion had been corrected. Esther reflected on the years she had spent believing that endurance was a passive state, something imposed rather than chosen. She saw now that endurance could also be active, deliberate. The bag had endured because someone had planned for it to. The truth had endured because someone had refused to destroy it, even when silencing it would have been easier. and she herself had endured, carrying forward a life shaped by forces she had never been allowed to name, until at last those forces were brought into the open. She did not feel victorious. Victory implied conquest, an overcoming of enemies. What she felt was alignment. Past and present no longer stood in opposition. They had been connected, acknowledged, placed in relation to one another. That was enough. In the days that followed, Esther returned fully to her work. People brought her their damaged belongings as they always had: a cracked handle, a torn lining, a broken clasp. She repaired them with the same care she always had, though she noticed a subtle shift in herself. She was lighter, more patient, less inclined to carry the weight of what could not be fixed. Occasionally, news reached her indirectly: mentions of reopened investigations, quiet acknowledgments of wrongdoing long denied, settlements discussed in careful language. No one came to her door. No one asked for her story. She did not offer it. The truth no longer required her voice to exist. One afternoon, as she swept the garage floor, she paused and looked again at the shelf where the bag rested. It looked unremarkable, indistinguishable from the other restored items around it. She felt no urge to touch it, no sense of unfinished business. Its role in her life had concluded cleanly, without residue. Esther closed the garage for the evening and walked back into her house as the light faded from the sky. The neighborhood settled into night, quiet and unchanged. Yet beneath that stillness, something fundamental had shifted, not in brick or concrete, but in record and memory. The past had been allowed to speak. The truth had been released from its hiding place. And in the end, all that remained was a final stitch, holding together what time had tried, unsuccessfully, to pull apart. If this story kept you watching until the end, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Some of them go even deeper than this one. Watch the other videos on the channel to uncover more hidden truths, forgotten cases, and stories that were never meant to be found. And share this video with someone who loves real mysteries. You never know what detail they might notice.